Chitra Soundar is an Indian-born British author and storyteller based in London, and she's written over 30 books published across Asia, Europe and North America. Her wide range of titles include picture books, stories for emerging readers, poetry and junior fiction. Chitra grew up hearing tales from Indian epics and folk wisdom, and her stories are often set in India, inspired by her heritage. She often runs writing and storytelling workshops to share her belief that stories widen our imagination and help us understand the people we share our planet with. And she recently met with Nikki Gamble to chat about her work and latest titles.
I've long appreciated and admired your storytelling, and as you know, we're going to be including a lot of your books in our forthcoming projects. I thought it would be a great opportunity to catch up with you. One of the things, I do know that you have a former kind of working life before you became a writer, and not one that seems to lend itself naturally to storytelling and writing. So I'm really interested to know how you made that transition.
I think I was always a writer and a storyteller. So through school, through university, I always wrote. I wrote essays, I wrote poetry, I wrote stories. Less stories, I would think, a lot of diary. But I wrote a lot of poetry and essays. And storytelling is part of the family. So my grandmother told stories. My grandmother's sisters who come to visit will always tell us stories. My mother is that kind of an improv dramatist. So she used to just make up plays for us to go and sketch for us to do on stage. And we learned how she developed it right there on the stage. And we used to work with her on those kind of things. But as a published author, I think I've been always wanting to do it. And then I started doing it when I was in Singapore, and I suddenly had weekends free. Because in India you work 6.5 days, or 6 days a week. So I didn't have weekends free. So suddenly in Singapore I had weekends free, and I started to write more, and I started to tell stories.
That's amazing. So in India you were working in banking, weren't you?
In India, I was teaching computer science.
Right.
And then I moved to Singapore to work in banking, but using my computer science skill set. And then I moved to the UK through the same bank, which I was working in Singapore, and then gave me an opportunity because Singapore's publishing market is very different to UK. They're more focused on non-fiction, but also there are very few picture books, and I was a big picture book fan. So I wanted to come to the UK, so I got a job opportunity here through the same company, and then I came here. And I've been doing both together, and the bank was extremely supportive of my writing. They used to constantly keep asking me about my next book and what I'm working on, so they were very supportive.
Fantastic. Really good to hear an employer supporting that, and also to hear that it wasn't such a leap into something, but more that it was gradually allowed to surface and take over. And what was the first book then that came, the first published book?
The first published book was a collection of retellings that I did for a Singapore publisher called Asia Pac Books. They did cultural books for the 4 communities which are in Singapore, which is Asian, which is more Tamils like me, Chinese, Eurasian and Malay communities. So they did cultural books for these 4 groups of people, and I retold stories from the Indian folktale body of work, and then I started writing for them quite a lot. My first picture book was with Tulika Books in India, and it was originally written as a single picture book, then it became a bilingual, so they published it in 6 bilingual editions, so my words in English, and they translated it to Indian languages.
Can we talk a little bit about storytelling? You've talked quite a bit about retelling. Do you see yourself primarily as a storyteller or as a writer? Are there differences between those two things? Can you be one without the other?
So there's oral storytelling is a art form which is very big in India, and it's come back very big in India, but again after I left the country. I grew up on oral storytelling at home. in year 3, when I was in school, I went to an assembly, entered a competition, told the story to a huge primary school of ours. We were 8 form entry, and I won the first prize. And since then, I always knew I wanted to tell stories. But I became really shy as I grew up, and I didn't want to go in front of anybody. And I don't think I started performing until my Falgu books in India came out, and I realized Falgu books had a lot of retelling, oral storytelling capabilities. But I think I'm a writer first, because the stories that I tell now are mostly from my books. But I do tell oral stories for adults and for children that could come from the Indian subcontinent. So I try and tell stories all the time. But if you want me to pick one slot, I want to be a writer, because I think I have more space to write and imagine and tell my own original stories. When I'm telling on stage, I'm either telling from my existing books or I'm telling traditional tales. But when I'm writing, I can write from my imagination, so I prefer doing the imaginative work. But when I started telling on stage and I started performing my books, the performance aspect fed back into my writing, because then I started thinking about, how will I perform this book in front of a school audience? What will I take out if it's a 5-year-old who's reading this book? What will they get out of performing? What can a parent do? What can a storyteller do with this book? And therefore there will be a lot of sounds in my book, because I try and read and add sounds and want to make it a little bit more exciting as an oral storytelling experience as well. The second thing that makes it easy, it lends itself really well as a training in storytelling, is to be able to plan the story as if I'm telling it. So if I can't get into a story and I don't know how to start it, I will put myself in the position of telling the story and imagine, what would I need to tell? Where would the pause come? Where would the drama come? What will make the children listen? Then I'll go back and write it. So both have helped each other in many ways.
Really interesting to hear about that symbiotic relationship, really, between performance and writing. I think one of the things that really struck me, particularly with the 3 books that you've written for Lantana, the third one, which isn't out yet, You're Strong With Me, but will be soon, was the voice in the words, and it reads aloud to young children so well. Listening to you talk about the qualities of storytelling, I can see that feeding back into the writing. I wondered whether you would treat us to hearing perhaps the latest story, You're Strong With Me. I'd love to hear that.
Of course. Yeah, when I'm writing story, I read quite, like, probably 10 times more than I've written it, so then I can hear the words. So this is from You're Strong With Me, illustrated by Poonam Mistry, published by Lantana, as you said. It's set in Africa, and it's the story of a baby giraffe discovering its world with its mother. The rain clouds were long gone, and the dry season scorched the land and browned the grass. This was all new for the baby giraffe. She bounded through the grove and licked the coarse bark of the acacia tree. When she was hungry, she looked for her mother in the herd. "I'm right here," whispered her mother, nudging her from behind. "Don't wander off on your own too far." Scritch, scratch, the baby giraffe stretched up to shoo away the bird that landed on her mother's back. "Be nice to the oxpecker," said Mama Giraffe. "It eats itchy insects and cleans my fur." "What is it saying?" "The bird brings stories from the grassland," said Mama Giraffe. "The songs tell us about faraway friends." The baby giraffe fidgeted when the oxpecker flew onto her back. "Stay still," said Mama Giraffe. "But it hurts." "As you grow older, your coat will get thicker, and this will just be a tickle. Until then, you're strong with me."
Fabulous. And one of the things that we look for when we select books for the youngest children is the memorable aspect of the language. You know, that sense that on the fifth reading they're going to be joining in with you, and you certainly get the sense of that with these 3 books.
Yeah, I've been told by many parents that children love to say you're safe with me and you're snug with me when we go through, but also the sounds. Yesterday there was a parent who wrote on Twitter or Instagram, I can't remember, she said, the most favorite on You're Safe With Me was the de-dum with the thunder, and she loved to say it all day long.
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to talk a little bit about Patton's Pumpkin, which is one of the books that we're featuring in Take One Book. Now, I understand that this was a story originally that you heard from Kerala, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's from the borders. So the Western Ghats come from all the way up from Maharashtra, which is like just under Goa, and then they go all the way down to the Kerala side, so the western border. And they're called the Sahyadri Mountains. If you put those mountains from London, they'll go up to Amsterdam. So they're very, very long, and they're full of forest, and they're biodiverse, and they're a UNESCO protected biodiverse site. And there are lots of tribes in this forest because it stretches far across. So each regional neighborhood has its own tribe. And the tribe that is featured in this book, the Irula tribe, they live in the borders of Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And this is where, just below where Irula live, where the elephants are and the elephant sanctuaries are. And I grew up not very far from one of the towns that is in the foothills. I spent a year there when my father was working there. And a lot of the hill stations are here as well, that we used to go as children to visit. And it's a beautiful, beautiful mountain range. But I discovered this story because I Google a lot. And I'm fascinated with flood tales. And from Hindu mythology itself, there are quite a number of flood tales in the mythology. Mm-hmm. So I started collecting flood tales. I started reading up on flood tales from all parts of the world. And I still keep discovering new things. And I discovered this story in a research document written about the Irula people. But it was not even in the contents. It was almost in the preface when the researcher happened upon this story by chatting with the local village elder. And the village elder told him this story. And the researcher had written literally 2 lines about the story. So he just said, the ancestors saved the village from the flood by floating in a pumpkin. That's all was there in the story. Then I tracked down the researcher and spoke to him on the phone. And then he gave me his research notes. And then we went from there.
Fascinating. I'm interested in flood stories too. And just about every major religion has a flood story. Are they the same story, do we think? Or did they originate in separate parts of the world?
They definitely originated separately, because I think there was at some point after the Ice Age, there must have been huge deluge of water everywhere, which quite possibly can happen very soon with our poles melting. But that kind of triggered warning tales and stories, I think, across the world, because I've heard different types of stories and they're very geographically correct, which makes me think it was written for that neighborhood, for that region, within the framework of where they live, because those days they don't have the internet, they don't know about other people. All they know is the geography of where they are living. So there's a Hindu mythology tale which has been there for 2,000 years, where he creates a boat which is very similar, but not the same as Noah's Ark, because it doesn't talk about taking people and everything. There is Southeast Asian ones in Indonesia and Malaysia and Philippines, which are very different and which are very specific to the swamps in which they are living. And there's a Russian one that James Mayhew and I discussed, which was like completely submerged towns. Then
there's the whole Gilgamesh
yeah,
story as well,
yeah.
which is very old, isn't it? And probably does have links, do you think?
I think they have more links to Sumerian, I thought.
Right.
Yeah, so I think Sumerian and some of the cultures mingled because they could travel, and then at some point the tectonic plate shifted and India and Africa split. So there are stories that have links to both, because when I read the story, somebody said, oh, in Africa as well people make gourds, and yes, they do. And that's kind of when I did some research in British Library, it said both originated when India and Africa were connected, when the tectonic plates hadn't broken up. So it's completely fascinating body, and I'm still researching. James and I are plotting a project.
I'm quite excited to hear about that one. You changed some elements of the story, didn't you, to make it, I mean, was it a pumpkin? Or was that one of the things that you decided to make it more relatable?
So I always spend a lot of time researching, even if it's a story from my own part of the world. So when the researcher gave me the details of where he met the people and what kind of tribe it was, I researched them for months. And he had translated it from the local language. So then I went and did research on pumpkins in India, because I know it came from South America, so there couldn't have been pumpkins in India. So the British Library research revealed that there was no pumpkins at that point in India. The gourds were there, but there was no pumpkins. And the whole story was written calling it Parton's Pumpkin because it's alliterated. So I went back to the publisher and said, look, I'm going to change it, maybe change his name as well. Yeah. The original fruit that was used, or the vegetable that was used, is called suraka. It's a bottle gourd. It's in the shape of a boat. It's like, those old feeding bottles?
Yes.
It's in that shape. And it's a light green in color. And this is the actual vegetable, because I had to call up the researcher and ask him to read out his regional language notes. And he read it out, and I said, but that's not pumpkin. And he said, oh yeah, I made a mistake. It's not pumpkin, it's suraka, the bottle gourd. But we then decided nobody will understand. Half the time I'll have to spend half a page explaining what a suraka is, and it won't have a catchy title. So we decided to take artistic license in making it a pumpkin, because most of both Western and Eastern world understand what a pumpkin is. But we insisted we put a note inside that explains that.
I have to say, there is something wonderfully humorous about a pumpkin shape. In which they, as opposed to something that would be more boat-like. So it's got an added sense of humour in there. And beautiful colour too.
It's the colour. So when my publisher heard the story and she knew that's a story she wanted me to write, the first thing she said was, I want you to write this story and I can see a big pumpkin on the cover. And she knew that's what she wanted from the beginning. The funny thing is, since then I've discovered so much more about the pumpkin. So in Canada, every year in October, there is a pumpkin boat race. So they take a huge pumpkin, chop the top off, make it into a boat, and have a boat race.
So it does
really happen. And there's a man who used a drill recently in the UK to carve out inside of the pumpkin and float in his local river. Mm-hmm. Wow. So people do this, and so it's definitely possible that this happened for real.
Fantastic. I want to turn to your short story collections that you've done with Walker Books. There are two of them, A Dollop of Ghee and A Pot of Wisdom, and A Jar of Pickle and
A Pinch of Justice.
So these stories, are these stories from your childhood, the repertoire of stories that you remember from your childhood?
Yes, so India has this body of folk tales called trickster tales. They are not similar to Anansi stories, because Anansi stories have a lot of creation myths as well. These are folk tales that originated during the Middle Ages, when monarchy was there in every region, and each king used to have something called a court jester. So he was the entertainer of the court. So he could sing, he could dance, but he was predominantly a jokey, clownish person. But he was also very clever. So every region has one character like that, which they think is the smartest person in the king's court. So in Andhra Pradesh, they had Tenali Rama, they had Birbal for King Akbar in the north, and they had a few in Calcutta, they had some in Karnataka. So they had these different people. But then as over the centuries, those stories have all mixed up. So a Birbal story could become a Tenali Rama story, and a Rama story could become another character, but the theme is the same. There is an injustice, either against the court jester or against a person who doesn't have a voice, and the court jester will solve the problem. And I am fascinated with trickster tales. I collect trickster tales as well as a storyteller. That's my favorite aspect of folk tales. So my grandmother never used to give me advice. She'll always say things like, "Oh, you're like the cat that drank the hot milk." And I'll be like, "What?" And then she'll tell me a story that goes with that proverb. Or she'll give me another story with another advice, like you should try everything at least once. And then she'll tell me a story for that. So I thought, okay, that's a great way to, those are funny, very clever stories, but they also have a sense of right and wrong. So I wanted to tell those stories, but I wanted to make them more accessible to children, because 13th century court jester is a very faraway concept. So I wanted to make them boys who want to fight for the right things. I wrote them as boys simply because they were set in kind of a king and queen era. But now I feel maybe I should have put one girl in it. But then my nephews are both boys, and they absolutely love, and they pretend to be Veera and Suku.
Oh, fantastic. There's a fantastic tradition of storytelling, as you've said, in India, including the Panchatantra tales, which are fables, aren't they?
Yeah, so they are predating Aesop. So there's a lot of research which says Aesop could have come from Panchatantra. So they were stories on strategy, war, administration of politics, of how a king should rule, but they're all told as metaphors. So they're all told as stories that happen to animals. But they're also story within story within story format. So there's a frame story, which is the moral of the story, but within that there will be 5 or 6 different stories which keep going. So you have to read all of them to understand what the big picture of that theme is.
Right, because Aesop is obviously very familiar to children here, but not so much Panchatantra. Does it mean 5 stories?
No, it means 5 truths, 5 skills or strategies.
Okay.
And he talks about 5 different things like administration, war, management, and things like that.
Right. So. And would they have been stories for like wisdom for adults?
No, there is a specific reason. So there was a king who had sons who did not believe, did not want to be responsible, and the king was very worried that he wasn't going to leave the kingdom to responsible monarchs. So he sends them to the forest to this guru who wants to teach them the art of being a king. So then he realizes that these boys are not going to be able to listen and read scriptures and memorize scriptures and understand. So he tells them stories and teaches them the various truths. Similar to Panchatantra, the Buddhist tradition has Jataka tales. So they're more kind of end with religious themes, but they're very similar trickster tales. One of the very famous one is the monkey and the crocodile, which is a Panchatantra story and the Jataka story, and and I heard Somebody say it has travelled all the way to Africa as well.
Fantastic. Are these stories that you would consider retelling?
Absolutely, yeah. It's very hard to find publishers who understand the value of it here. But if there is an opportunity, I'll just seize it, because I know so many of those stories, and I've read an original translation that Oxford University Press published. I can read Sanskrit, but obviously it's easier reading the English translation and then going. But it's the linked stories that Western publishers are not comfortable with.
Right.
They don't want 6 linked stories, but they can be taken separately and told.
Yeah.
But recently I have found that they're very worried about trickster tales, because a lot of trickster tales, if you say, for example, I retell a story orally from Thailand. It's a story about tying up a tiger and setting it on fire.
Yes, yeah.
Because in olden times, the tiger was the biggest threat to farmers growing rice in Thailand. But that story can't be retold anymore to the Western audience. They
Tiger's endangered.
Yes,
and
they think of... Yeah, exactly. But they don't understand the metaphor behind those. So it's a very different proposition to bring Panchatantra to a Western audience without the context of it.
Interesting. The other thing that I wanted to ask you before we go back and talk about your writing again is the mythology, and why has it escaped me? You know, the one that they did the big television series of, the Seven Brothers.
Ramayana.
Yeah, exactly. We don't hear much retellings of those either here.
So the British Asian population is very much a mix of Hindus and Pakistanis. So there's a lot of Hindu and Muslim stories that need to be told. So when you say British Asian, a lot of people don't think of Hindu stories. Immediately when you go to Hindu mythology, then you become religious a little bit.
Okay.
We don't have fairy tales. All our stories are in mythology. So there are loads of stories I'm retelling for another publisher in India. There are lots of stories that you can take out from the larger body. So for example, the Ramayana is huge, 7-book epic, and each of the books have thousands of little stories and people throughout that adventure, and you can take out individual ones and retell them. But I think there was when probably the 80s, there were some retellings.
And there was a huge television series, wasn't there?
In India.
Yeah.
In India, there's still Mahabharata. Now they've gone to Krishna.
Right.
And they've gone to individual heroes, Hanuman, and they're doing lots of there are loads of South Indian ones which are not done by the North Indian TV industry. But I have one idea which I've been playing with in my head, but I want to take the mythology and set adventures in them. Like there are a couple of US writers who are doing that already, but from the mythology of because there is again a big difference between people who worship Shiva and people who worship Vishnu. So therefore the stories that they kind of relate to are different and things like that. So there's a huge body of work there.
It's going to keep you busy.
Oh, yes.
Let's come back to some of the books that you have written again, having taken that wonderful detour through Indian stories and where they come from. A little bit of a shift, actually, because you've moved into non-fiction. I think there's a new biography coming out for, 7 to 9 year olds?
Yeah, I think it's kind of 8 to 10, probably 9 to 12. It's kind of like younger middle grade.
Right. So tell us about that. It's due to be published very soon, September, I think.
So Puffin are doing, like many other publishers now, they're doing a series called The Extraordinary Lives, and they're doing both contemporary and people who are not alive anymore. So they've done Michelle Obama, Malala Yousafzai. So they've done a few, and they were looking for somebody to do Gandhi. And I have a very interesting relationship with the life of Gandhi, and we grew up learning Indian history, obviously, and I have huge interest in the freedom struggle and the British colonialism. and how it created this diaspora of Indian people across the world by taking them and putting them in farms and estates and whatever and across the world. So when I got the chance to retell Gandhi's life, I completely said, yes, I'm going to do this. But I've been writing non-fiction forever. I've written for the Singapore publisher. I've written lots of magazine stuff in the US and a lot of little tiny books. But this is my first big non-fiction, that, and especially about somebody so big. But it was very, very interesting reading about... he's written quite a lot himself, because he wrote his biography. He also wrote weekly articles during his freedom struggle in both South Africa and in India, and therefore there was a lot of body of writing that was available to hear his voice. And of course there were videos of him. Then Gandhi movie was made by Attenborough, so we were able to watch that. But also I read his contemporaries as well, what were they saying at that time. In India, the other people were saying what context was he in, what was the British monarchy saying, what was the British politicians saying at that time. So all of that kind of fed into it. But also for me, living in Britain now, being British, to tell that story, I wanted to stand back and look at it from both the point of view and be able to say, okay, this is what Gandhi fought for, and we haven't achieved all of that yet, but this is kind of how it reflects today and how it reflected in those days. And especially with things happening around Brexit, it was a good opportunity to look at it from how are we going back to that sense of we are a colonial empire. So I was able to look at it from that point of view as well. But obviously this is being retold for 9 to 12-year-olds, so we had to make sure that we weren't very in the face with the violence or with the things, but we explained everything in a way that children can understand and can come to it. And it's also got lots of images and pictures and quotes, so they're not bogged down by too much text.
Fantastic. Well, knowing you, Chitra, there must be at least 5 projects on the go at the moment. But can you tell us about some of the things that you're working on and hope will be coming to fruition soon?
I have something coming up with Walk Books next year. So we've set it in India this time, and it's a contemporary story about a little girl and her baby sister. So that's coming out next year. I have from Bloomsbury 2 books coming out on the Educational Young Readers series. The first one is coming out this year and 2 more are coming out next year. So those are all kind of done and dusted, so they're proceeding on their publishing path. And I'm working on probably all the time new projects, new characters. I do want to write, and I have written, and I'm waiting for publishers to come back on a multicultural, mixed race British Asian family, which is like my sisters, where the children have 2 cultures to contend with, more than 1 language to deal with, and at the same time be able to adopt both, and how that is funny and at the same time very rewarding. So that's, I've written it and I'm waiting for publishers to let me know.
Fantastic. And finally, you know that most of our listeners are teachers or student teachers or school librarians, and I know that working in schools is quite important to you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do when you visit schools?
So I do quite a lot of school visits, and I go everywhere in the world. I do multiple things. So I'll do an assembly, and then I'll do individual writing workshops. So that could be in classrooms, that could be just for able children. The school can decide how they do it. But I do usually writing workshops where I collaborate with the children to come up with a story, and then the children go away to write and illustrate that story. And it's usually very rewarding to see at the end of the workshop, they all have a paper with the storyboard done. Some people have written, some people have drawn, and they've done all of that. I also do like teacher CPDs. on writing, because I realized when I go into schools to teach writing for children, the teachers are scared to write stories themselves, so they haven't tried it even if they are not scared of it. And I kind of give them, I run workshops for them to see how they can learn how quickly to make up a story and how they can teach the children to teach writing. And I do library events as well. So I tell stories as an oral storyteller from my own books, but I also do library workshops if they wanted to learn to write.
And people can get in touch with you via your website.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the website, there's a big section on school visits. And there's a lot of resources for teachers on school visits as well, like how do you prepare for a school visit, how do you gain a lot from it. So if you go on to chitrasoundar.com, you can find all of the information.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for at last coming to talk to us in the Reading Corner. I've learnt so much today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you for having me at the Reading Corner.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues. Just Imagine also has a free fortnightly newsletter packed full of the latest news, CPD training, reviews and giveaways. To sign up, visit justimagine.co.uk/newsletter.